Wonderful. All right. So our subject matter for discussion is the 2025 blueprint for the six-county Sacramento region. SACOG staff are here today to give updates about the blueprint, the technical methodologies used for land use and transportation assumptions, followed by additional Q&A and announcements at the end. Throughout the presentation, we will also allow time for guests to answer questions or ask questions and make comments as well. As a housekeeping reminder, if you have questions or comments, please use the reactions tab at the very bottom to raise your hand and or enter them in the chat box below, where it'll be monitored and elevated to presenters, and I'll do my best to elevate those questions and comments. Now let's dive into the presentation from our friends at SACOG and meet our speakers. I'll hand it over to you, Hannah, for your introduction and presentation kickoff. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. So hello, my name is Hannah Tschudin. I'm the outreach coordinator here at SACOG, and today we're giving a presentation or an update on the blueprint. Next slide. Before we kick off just our own agenda, we'll give you some background and overview information about the blueprint. We'll get into our outreach and engagement that we've done for the plan. We'll talk about our land use assumptions, our transportation project list, and some next steps for how to stay tuned and engaged as we finalize the plan. Next slide. First, I should probably give some background about what SACOG is. We are the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. We work with 6 counties and 22 cities in the region, and we're our region's metropolitan planning organization, and we play a central role in transportation infrastructure planning, as well as technical assistance and funding assistance to our cities, counties, transit operators, and more. Next slide. And so before we get into the 2025 blueprint, I should give you a bit of a history lesson on how we got to this name. So about 20 years ago, back in 2004, our region came together to draft the Sacramento region blueprint. This was a revolutionary undertaking that compelled a critical assessment of land use and transportation planning in the region. In short, by doing this, the blueprint aims to cut urban sprawl, reduce vehicle emissions and congestions in order to improve quality of life for the region. It accomplished this by developing some smart growth principles, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But it ultimately set the precedent for how MPOs do long-range planning, becoming SB 375. And 20 years later, in the Sacramento Region Blueprint and the MTP SES, or the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategies, now have the same horizon year of 2050. So to pay homage to the original 2004 blueprint, we have renamed this MTP SES, or Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategies, the 2025 blueprint, which is great because that is definitely a mouthful. Next slide, please. So what is the blueprint? Well, it's a federally required document that we have to do, but it's also because we don't live our lives in just one neighborhood, one city, or one county. So when it comes to transportation planning especially, we've got to work together. And then also this plan is strategic and fiscally constrained. It is not a wish list or a stapling exercise. Next slide. And this plan is founded on our triple bottom line framework, which comes together around a collective vision to advance economic prosperity, support environmental health and resiliency, and promote equity through reducing transportation and housing disparities by race, ethnicity, income, and ability. Next slide. And just to get you caught up from where we've been and where we're going, a lot of work has been done. We've been working on this plan since about 2021. But in June, some key milestones started happening. First, in June, our land use assumptions were adopted by the board. In November, our project list was adopted by the board, which is really great. Right now, we're showing a 19.1% reduction, which exceeds the mandated greenhouse gas reduction target by CARB. And to get there, we worked directly with local staff, many one-on-one meetings. We held a number of office hours, workshops, all that sort of stuff to engage with local staff working on these projects to make sure we got the best outcome. And the work is not done yet. This project list will be combined with the land use assumptions to form the final preferred scenario for the plan. And it will also create a list of policies that will help the region implement the plan when it's adopted in November. Okay, now for my bread and butter, next slide, we'll talk about some of the outreach we did. For this update for the blueprint, we really did a super robust engagement process, starting with partnering with Valley Vision to conduct the Built Environment Poll, which is a scientifically administered and regionally representative poll that surveyed around 3,000 residents. Next slide. We also hosted a series of focus groups in both English and Spanish, and had about 69 people participate in those. Next slide. And then we also had a SACOG-led survey, which was partnered with a pop-up workshop effort where we went to nearly every single city and county in the region to host pop-up workshops and get responses on our survey. We got about 2,700 responses. Next slide. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that about half of these responses came from our CBO partners who we provided mini grants to help us do this engagement work. And then next slide. Lastly, the regional workshop. I hope you were all familiar with this because you were there, but we had over 300 elected officials, public agency staff, and community leaders from across the 6-county region in Folsom to talk about all things Blueprint. Next slide. And I'll just cover a couple of our demographic information slides that we were able to collect. On the left here, you can see the SACOG data from a couple of our different efforts, and then on the right, you will see the census data for county makeup. And as you can see, it's pretty accurate and even of who we were able to speak with and who's in those counties. Next slide. Similarly, the blue is shown with the region and the pink is who we were able to survey. Again, a little bit more work to be done, but in terms of gender comparison, we pretty good. Next slide. Age comparison, I think it's interesting here is that those under 35 are definitely active and participating, only marginally more than they are represented in the region, but still cool to see. Next slide. For the race comparison, I would like to acknowledge that there's still more work to be done, but I think that the level that we are able to reach is definitely in part to some of our partners like Valley Vision and again, our CBO partners really helped us improve over the last few updates of who we were able to connect with. Next slide. And again, for income, good representation overall. Okay, now to the Blueprint principles. So like this update, the 2004 also had unprecedented engagement, which resulted in the smart growth vision for the future. And the visions were codified in 7 principles, which encourage a variety of housing options closer to employment, shopping centers, entertainment hubs, which ultimately allows people to walk, bike, or take transit to meet their daily needs. Similarly, next slide, sorry. Similarly, after a robust engagement process over the past few years, the region's vision for the future is more or less consistent with what the vision for the future of the region was 20 years ago. The region still wants more transportation options. They still want more housing options closer to those amenities and things like that. And they want people to be able to afford to continue to live here. There's still an interest in revitalizing existing assets. There's also, people are starting to see the value in complete communities. And the one thing I wanted to call out, there is 2 things that rose up in this round of outreach that was not there necessarily compared to 2004. And it's a bigger focus on telework and natural disasters. That isn't too surprising to me considering the pandemic and the things we've been through within the past couple decades. But yeah, there's still very much, the region wants a region of choice. They want to have options. And it's interesting that even over 20 years, the vision and what people want is still relatively consistent with new factors coming in. Perfect. I can pause there for a couple of questions, and then I'll hand it over to Kadin to talk about land use.
I don't see any questions at the moment. However, please feel free to ask the questions in the chat, and we'll also monitor that throughout the presentation. And we'll have an additional 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Go ahead.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dov.
All right. Well, hi everybody. My name is Kadin. I'm on the planning team here at SACOG. I work on all things land use and housing, and so for the 2025 blueprint, I'm coordinating the land use side of the plan. Apologize for my voice. I'm on the mend from a cold here, so I might take a few sips of water throughout. But I think that was a great background for kind of what we're trying to do with this plan. And I think taking an even bigger step back, when we're adopting the blueprint, at its core, we have 3 basic components. We have land use assumptions, right, for how we as a region can grow between now and 2050, the horizon of our plan. That, as Hannah mentioned, was adopted in June, right? We have a set of transportation investments that Sam is going to get into right after me. And that was, again, just adopted in November. And then those transportation investments are married to the land use, right? And then we have a set of policies that actually seek to implement that vision. And that's what's coming next in 2025 before we adopt the plan. So on the land use side, we've been doing parcel level kind of scenario planning at SACOG for about 20 years. Now it is a fairly labor intensive process, but I think the way to think about it is that it's essentially a constrained allocation of new homes and jobs over a 30-year period that, again, when we pair it with that transportation and policy, allows us to achieve a set of regional goals. And we're trying to do several things with this plan, but one of the key things we're trying to do is achieve this greenhouse gas reduction target that we get from the State Air Resources Board. And there is a lot of money that is tied to showing that we can achieve that goal, hundreds of millions of dollars of state competitive transportation funding. So there's this big sort of incentive for us to show that we can do that. We start kind of the land use side with this regional projection of jobs and homes for our 2020, between 2020, which is a base year of this plan, all the way up to 2050. And we adopted that regional growth forecast a few years ago, and it's 263,000 new jobs, 278,000 new homes. And we take that projection, which is a demographic and economic-based projection, and then we kind of allocate it down, down to the jurisdiction, down to the neighborhood, and actually all the way down to the parcel level. So we're making choices essentially on how much and what type of growth we're going to assume on every parcel in the region. It is a fairly aggressive regional assumption. We're not being super conservative with that. You can see we just actually in 2023 for the first time eclipsed our 20 to 35 annual housing growth that we assume in the plan. And we do actually think that is perhaps going to dip below as interest rates start to catch up with us here a little bit. But yes, it is a robust kind of housing and job assumption across the region. Difficult to kind of describe, what we're doing on every parcel, a million parcels in the region, right? So what we typically do is we describe our growth using these community types. This is a framing tool that we've used for a long time now. And essentially, you can think about these, right, as the red and the gray are our infill areas. What you can kind of think of as infill areas are existing communities, with red being kind of these like center of each community, right? So downtowns, suburban commercial corridors, right? Rural main streets, the parts of the region that are kind of really driving growth, right? And then the gray is sort of like filling in kind of the areas between those centers and corridors, but are still infill areas. And then the purple is really our developing communities. You can think of those as greenfields. These are places where there's potential for the region to expand our existing footprint outward, right? This is kind of how we do. I know I see some local jurisdiction staff on the call here, so you're very familiar with this huge spreadsheet, right? But this is kind of how we summarize that growth, where we have, within each community, there's sub-community types, right? And then, those are the rows there. And then each column is like existing conditions, what is theoretically allowed under general plans at the local level, and then what we're actually assuming there on the right. Every one of the rows is corresponding with a geographic area. We have this interactive map on our website if you really want to kind of dive in and kind of see what these areas are and how much we're assuming. And then this is kind of what it looks like behind the curtain. This is not really something that we put out on the website, but this is kind of how it looks like for us. And essentially we're using these regional place types and this kind of modeling tool to essentially paint growth onto each individual parcel. And then that kind of sums up to the community types. Just an important note, I guess, to mention, because I think if you work kind of at planning at the local level, like you're used to kind of the general plan process and zoning, right? Our plan is not a general plan. And the primary kind of difference, right, on the land use side at least, is if we were to model all of the general plan capacity across the region at the local level, we'd have orders of magnitude more growth than what, we're even than what is reasonable to assume and what we're anticipating will happen by 2050, even with that aggressive assumption. So, again, as Hannah said, it is not a stapling exercise, right? We are making calls on kind of which locally planned growth to include in kind of this phased way. And illustrating that point, again, 278,000 new homes, that's our regional growth projection by 2050. If we wanted to, we could theoretically fit 3 times that in our existing general plan for infill areas, right? So, that could all happen in infill areas. And oh, by the way, it could also all happen in these developing communities as well, right? So I guess the point is a tremendous variation in where that growth could occur. And so we have to kind of go through a process of figuring out kind of where within these guardrails it's landing for the purpose of our plan. And it's this, for us, a delicate balance between trying to be ambitious, but also trying to be achievable, right? We have a statutory obligation to be achievable and reasonable with that forecast. So we consider a variety of regulatory and market factors. So again, we stay within kind of these existing confines of what is already allowed and planned for by locals. So we're implementing local plans in that way, right? We look at market conditions like, permitting trends, proximity to jobs, infrastructure need. And then, the policy and performance piece is absolutely critical, right? This is not a business as usual kind of extrapolation, right? We are trying to accomplish a set of goals. And ultimately, perhaps the most important piece is that, that greenhouse gas reduction target from transportation, whether or not we can hit that. So we are always thinking about, what would best put us in a position to reach that target. And I think a lot of the folks are kind of familiar with this, right? But the primary way that we reduce that accomplish that target is reducing how much people drive, right? On average, the amount that people drive needs to go down, right? And so this is a map showing vehicle miles traveled, which is basically a metric for total driving, essentially, across the region based on where you live. And so the greener the area, the more we are trying, ideally, to model growth. If there is vacant or underutilized sites that are kind of in the green, we're likely assuming some growth on those parcels. As it starts to get more yellow, more orange, we're kind of having to weigh these kind of different considerations from that last slide and kind of make some in-out decisions. This is another way of kind of showing the reality that our VMT is lower in our infill areas and higher in our new growth areas. And that's not to say that, we aren't or even shouldn't have developing community growth. It just means that, if we're trying to have that red dotted line go down, which we need to have happen, you need to have more growth regionally in the red and the gray, right? So we went through this, scenario development process, this cycle called Pathways, where we were, really looking at the bookends of potential ways we could grow as a region. With Pathway 1, that's on the left, kind of reflecting kind of early 2000s style, very kind of explosive growth outward, right? Pathway 3, looking at a very kind of constrained 90% of growth in infill areas type of scenario. And, we modeled each of these and then presented an evaluation to the community, right, to the board. I'm sure many of the folks on this call kind of have seen kind of the evaluation of the pathways. And based on that, we developed this approach with local staff and with our board for narrowing in on a single set of assumptions for the plan, which again were adopted in June. And so that's what you see here. First and foremost, we were told essentially put something in front of us that achieves the GHG target and ensures that we're remaining eligible for those really key state transportation funding dollars. We also were told, put something in front of us that's feasible to implement, right? We frequently got this sort of like, don't give us a plan or utopia, was the term that we frequently heard from our board, right? Give us something that is possible, if we're going to actually, invest in these areas, right? So that was a necessary condition that we put into the scenario. And then we're also trying to, after we've met those conditions to the extent possible, right, optimize for these other factors like, the triple bottom line policy goals, right, which Sam is going to get into a little bit. And, also kind of incorporating local feedback, right? And recognizing that this is a political process, right? We have a board that is made up of local elected officials from every jurisdiction in the region, right? And so there's an element of wanting to kind of incorporate those local priorities both at the staff and board level. And so this is this slide that's showing where we landed with the now adopted land use assumptions. So this is the spatial distribution of housing in our infill areas. Again, in the pathways, we had 3 very different futures, ranging from less than half to almost 90 in pathway 3 percent of growth happening in these areas. The adopted assumptions are slightly more compact than pathway 2, with just over 2/3 of housing that's happening in these areas. And while this is basically the same proportion of growth that we've seen in these areas in the last 5 to 10 years even, the challenge, right, is keeping this share as the region continues to grow, right, over time, and as that regional production scales up, right, keeping the proportion as it scales up. And that takes really intentional action, particularly as you can kind of see illustrated here in the region's centers and corridors, where housing growth has been a little bit slower to take off, right? These are our growth engines for the region, centers and corridors. That's where a lot of the jobs happen. We have historically not seen as much housing as we think has a lot of potential to happen in these areas. And so that's a key kind of implementation challenge in our plan. And then, finally, creating a more kind of efficient and compact land use pattern comes with a shift in the types of housing that we build. And specifically, this means building more attached housing and kind of housing on like multifamily apartments, right? Townhomes, and then housing on smaller lots as well, right? So even if it's detached on smaller lots, and that's necessary to achieve a kind of spatially efficient land use pattern that, allows us to achieve our goals. But it's also reflecting some real kind of demographic and demand shifts that we've seen in our region as well as nationally. So household sizes are shrinking, and what used to be, this is a slide from our region. This has definitely happened nationally as well. What used to be the most common household type, the nuclear family, is being replaced by smaller households that are made up of adults living alone or adults living with roommates, right? And so there's a shift in demand that comes with that, right? And of course, there's a huge affordability angle here, which is another kind of big component of what we're trying to accomplish with the plan, which is to kind of make our region more affordable. And so there's kind of a policy need for this, but there's also kind of a demand driving factor here, where attached housing and smaller lot products are what most folks can afford right now. Right? The median household cannot afford a large lot single family home. So here are our adopted land use assumptions by product type, which have the kind of share of attached products that are kind of increasing from existing, right? So 32 to 36% by 2050. So we're still going to be a predominantly single family region, right, in 2050, but just, more housing choice, right, for folks who can't afford that kind of larger house. And then you see the dotted areas, that's showing how much new housing in each category it takes to kind of deliver those shifts. And basically what this means is we need about half of new housing units need to be attached, right? Half of new housing needs to be attached between now and 2050 for us to kind of achieve these goals. And while we're not there yet, there are some indications that, like the rest of the country, this is the direction we are headed. You can kind of see on the left side of the screen, the proportion of new homes that are, single family on large lots is decreasing lower and lower over time. On the right, you have housing permits in our region over the last 10 years, and the share of permits that are attached or are ADUs has basically doubled all the way up to 46% last year. So again, there's, I think, some room for optimism on these assumptions, but interest rates, other headwinds in the coming years here, implementing the land use assumptions of this plan is going to require, policies, programs, investments to kind of accelerate some of these trends. I think that's all I have. We're going to jump into the next part of our presentation, which is the transportation side and some of the performance side, but I'm happy to answer any quick questions now before we do that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dov, and thanks, Hannah, for the intro. I think we have a handful of questions in the chat, so would love to have you all address Jaime's question, and then we'll go to Shira since she has her hand raised as well, and then we'll kick it over to Richard and Guy for their question. But Jaime asked in the chat, In the community's response to ensure access and opportunity for all residents, is that specific to any sector, like transportation access, medical, etc.?
Yeah, so I'll read you the full description of what that principle really is standing for, and it's ensure access and opportunity for all residents and provide an inclusive engagement process to ensure all residents can access housing, jobs, and services without being disproportionately impacted. So I'd say less so to connect to a certain place, but to make sure that we're really focusing on equitable engagement processes where folks can get involved and let their voice be heard so that we're ensuring positive results so that folks aren't disproportionately impacted because they've been left out of the conversation. So that's how I respond.
Thanks, Yana. And then I'll Shira, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Shira with Atrium 916. We're a Creative Innovation Center for Sustainability. I have a number of questions. One, the cost to look only at transportation is a choice. I think there are many factors that go into greenhouse gas. That is food waste that goes, that's a huge emitter. We have transportation of waste and waste creation. So as we have increasing growth in people, we also have increase in waste and how we're looking at that. This model looks at making the assumption that most people work within the core, not people that actually live in the core and travel outside. So we do have a lot of people there. So I'm wondering how that was factored in. Sorry, I have a lot of questions. I do apologize, and I'm going to rapid fire them. And then what else? Oh, and to talk about mixed use, if we're talking about land use, so if we are doing like new regions, like are we looking at mixed use? Because mixed use creates that whole community that we're talking about, is like that we're making sure that we've got all the amenities, including creativity and entertainment, so that way we can stay within our community. Like, is that being looked at? And how does this all work with the consistent expansion of freeways? Like, as long as we are making the freeways, they keep getting more accessible, better, or whatever. The 50's always, I don't know, ever since I've been here, is always in progress. As long as it's easier to travel by car, and as long as it's quicker and more convenient and more fun, people will travel by car. Once it becomes more fun, it doesn't have to be quicker, it just can be more fun too. Then people will travel in other means. So I know rapid fire. Thank you.
Okay, I'll do my best. So on the question around like why just look at transportation? So this is a good question. So the state has a scoping plan, right, for trying to address greenhouse gas emissions across all of the different sectors that produce greenhouse gas emissions. And I guess we should have said this up front, but our responsibility at SACOG as a part of this plan is a very small piece of that pie. It's not to dismiss the fact that there are other sectors that are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, but the 19% target that we get from the state to expand it is just a 19% greenhouse gas emission from passenger vehicles below 2005 levels by 2035. So it's this very specific slice of the pie. And then you have a variety of other actors kind of in the public realm that are responsible for the other pieces of the pie. So like food waste and like, even within air quality, for example, the Air Quality Management District, right? They have responsibility for other kind of air quality components. And even, so frequently we get this like question of like, well, like, what does it matter if you have this kind of greenfield project if all of the houses are going to be all electric, right? And even the cars that they have will be EVs. And it's like, okay, well, yes, that is true and that is real, but like in terms of what we're responsible for, it's specifically the greenhouse gas emissions from the tailpipe emissions of the cars themselves. And so it's just a very small piece of the pie that we're kind of responsible for. Living in the core and working outside. So we have, and maybe Sam will get into this slightly, but we have this very complicated travel model that estimates all of this, right? So we literally have it's called an activity-based travel model that is essentially doing a simulation, and we have where everybody lives and where everybody works. And so it has origins and destinations. And so it is accounting for where everybody is traveling. And then it's like summing all of that up and finding some sort of average of like what is the average amount people are driving on a typical, Thursday weekday. So it is absolutely accounting for this kind of I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but like mismatch, right, of essentially where people live versus where they work. And yes, if they live in the downtown core, right, many people are working in the downtown core, but many are not. And so it is accounting for all of that.
Right. Scattergram and drive times and kind of,
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
familiar with those. Yep.
All of that. Yeah. So we're absolutely accounting for all of that. There's a question about like complete communities and like mixed use, right? And so I think that is you're essentially hitting on the primary mechanism by which our plan is reducing the average VMT and greenhouse gas emissions, right? Which is this idea that we're trying to avoid kind of a setup and a development pattern where you live in a bedroom community in a far-flung area and have to drive a very long distance to get to all of your daily needs, right? And so there's two things happening. We're trying to, like, as a part of the land use assumptions, encourage and facilitate more housing in the really jobs rich parts of the region. And one thing I didn't talk about just for time is we're also trying to facilitate more jobs in the housing rich parts of the region to kind of create these complete communities. So there's some developing communities in the region that we're like really trying to lean in on the job side, right? Like Folsom South of 50 with new hospitals, like Placer One up in Placer County, with a new university, right? Like in Elk Grove, right, with the livable employment area. There's all these places where we really want to kind of lean in and create these complete communities, even if they are developing in kind of greenfield areas. And then the last thing you asked, I think, was around expansion of freeways. And that's absolutely, you're absolutely right? That there is an inducement effect when you are expanding freeway capacity. You are inducing both transportation demand as well as shifting land use patterns. And so we are trying to be, and Sam will get into this, I think, judicious about the extent to which we are expanding auto capacity as part of our plan, but there are political dynamics there as well.
I appreciate that. And just one more to add, schools. So it's not just about jobs, it's also about schools. How much people have to drive, they go to work, but then they have to drive to the school to pick up the kids and then drive back, and that congestion around that. And so having kids be able to walk to school is like a luxury. So just to consider that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, Shira, for the wonderful questions, and Dal for the presentation. I think for the purpose of our agenda and staying on track, and then we want to get to Sam's portion of the presentation, could you, Dal, address that question from Guy? And then when we get to the additional Q&A, we can address Richard's question as well.
Yeah, so all of the numbers that I mentioned, the key time horizons that we have in our plan are 2035 and 2050. But all of the numbers that I mentioned were through 2050, and we have a base year of 2020. So it's a 2020 to 2050 time period for the 263,000 new jobs, 278,000 new homes. And then I can just really quickly address Steve and Cheryl's question. So this, I think you're referring to the community types map, right? That had yeah, so this has everything, and you'll see potential developing communities. This is an early slide from when we were doing pathways. You are absolutely correct that not all of the developing communities that are considered potential developing communities, as in this map, were adopted as part of our assumptions. So it is a more constrained list, but this was the universe of developing communities that have been proposed at the local level. So on our website, you can see see the actual kind of adopted assumptions.
Wonderful. Do you hear my dogs in the background barking? I apologize if you do. Oh, great.
No.
Awesome. Thanks, Dal, for answering the question. And actually, Giovanna, it's quiet in here. Are you all done? I will be leaving 1 minute unless I hear someone talking. Is anyone having issues hearing this presentation?
I think that's an AI thing. Just
Oh,
let it do its thing, I guess.
gotcha. That's hilarious. Okay. AI is in the room. All right. Thanks, Steve and Cheryl, for that question. And then we'll kick it over to Sam for his portion.
Thanks, Kathy. Uh, I know most of you on the call, maybe about half. I see a lot of project sponsors in there, but I'm Sam Shelton. I'm a senior analyst with SACOG, and I'm the transportation coordinator for the 2025 blueprint. So it's my job to help list out all of the different transportation project investments that we will spend nearly $40 billion on by 2050. And a good chunk of how we built the transportation project list and modeled it has an awful lot to do with what Dov just put together as far as tying those investments back to the land use vision by 2035 and 2050. So my set of slides will go through a little bit about how we built that transportation project list and transportation model network into a handful of details, and then end on how that compared to pathways and what are some of the results that we get out of all of that hard work that the board acted on in November with the transportation project list. So we can go to the next slide, please, Dov. Thanks. So yes, we just took an action on the adopted scenario in November that ties to that land use. But really, we started working closely with sponsors on that initial scenario in March. Before that, you heard Dov talk a bit about pathways. I'll chat about that a bit, but that was the year beforehand. Next slide, please. So we did start a call for projects with local agencies back in 2022. We had a new kind of project nomination process where we shared an awful lot of information with sponsors in a GIS-based web tool where they could specifically draw their projects out and see past plans land use in addition to a number of different objectives for equity, economy, and the environment of our triple bottom line. So we are sharing a lot about the different needs assessments out there with the sponsors. And we took a lot of that information and helped understand how to craft 3 pathways, which I'll get back to in a second. Then over the last year, we had a couple of different phases of sponsor engagement, talking through that initial scenario with folks, and then closer to the finish line in phase 2, trying to tighten up the project list, understanding the last bits and pieces before we landed in November. Next slide. So where do we really start? If you look back at the broad categories of project investment from the last adopted plan in 2020, right, there were over $12 billion set aside for pavement rehabilitation as well as transit vehicle replacement. Road and highway capacity is still rather large, from 6.8 billion to the initial nominations of almost 12 billion, 14 billion by the end of the nomination process. I'll get to in a second. There's still quite a bit of cash there for transit. That's a lot of it's operating as well. We didn't get as many nominations on that side of thing. Same thing for bike and pedestrian investments. In the last plan, we had 2.5 billion. In the initial nominations, it wasn't as much, only 1.7 billion. And then everything else at the bottom, program safety, system management, operations, you can imagine these projects as being, they're not adding roadway capacity. They're not adding bike and pedestrian capacity. They're not adding an additional new transit options or service hours for routes. This is everything else. These are safety investments. These are improving what we have on the ground today, like traffic signal improvements. Next slide, please. So what's that look like when you start looking at probably the worst problem we have to solve for, roadway, highway capacity project nominations that are linked closer to build out from general plans. So when Dov was mentioning, here's the build out capacity that we can't possibly include in the plan, we still get all of the different roadway capacity projects that sponsors want to include in the plan that could be connected to those projects and funded through impact fees or various grants related to that growth moving forward in the plan. So we have a big challenge. And by the end that we were talking to sponsors, that was almost $14 billion of projects that we simply don't have that much cash for. The plan needs to be financially constrained. The next slide, please. So Dov mentioned the pathways, where pathway 1 was more outward expansion. You can imagine what that map might look like as you expand outward and the kind of roadway capacity that would go along with that, versus say pathway 3, which is more infill focused, or pathway 2, which was the last plan, a bit more balanced. If you hit the next slide, please. This is a quick set of maps that give you an idea of how very different these pathways were when it came to a transportation network, where the red lines are more of the highway expansion, especially the dotted ones, and the orange lines are more of those arterial expansion projects, whether it's 2 to 4 lanes or 4 to 6 lane widenings, in say the pathway 1 scenario versus a pathway 3, which is a lot more infill. We need a lot less of that kind of transportation network. So we knew to achieve our goals, it had to land somewhere between pathway 2 and pathway 3. It had to be a bit more aggressive than the last plan. Next slide, please. So we were able to screen every project nomination that came in, loaded it into our transportation demand model, along with many different other indicators about the needs for transportation, and the linkages to land use, as far as the assumptions that Dov worked really hard to build into for those initial scenarios, and the economic ties about where folks were driving to work, their daily trips. As someone mentioned schools earlier, a lot of that is captured within our travel demand model. And from those different needs that we saw from a lot of these pieces, we had a lot of one-on-one meetings with sponsors about the value of their project, whether or not we could afford it, and if it was achieving the goals of the plan. And then next slide, please. To be able to talk with those sponsors, we had to develop a lot of quick web accessible tools to help the sponsors understand the changes from the last plan, the needs for those projects, and to have frankly, a better robust discussion about the linkages of their projects and their benefits to the land use assumptions in the plan, whether the initial nominations that numbered in over 2,000, you see at the top left graphic, to all the different roadway projects we pulled from initial scenarios. You can see the blue lines of dropped off roadway capacity projects that we were talking to sponsors about quite a bit, and then sharing it at the parcel level, those initial assumptions, and trying to help sponsors understand why they might have seen their project dropped off and how that relates to the benefits from the plan. The next slide, please. So when you start adding up the cash or the lane miles of roadway capacity that are part of those different pathways compared to, say, where we're at in 2020, the adopted scenario that the board acted on in November is between pathways 2 and 3. Yes, we're adding more lane miles of roadway, and it's going to cost a bit less than pathway 2. So we know we're between the two of those, and we're still able to increase the number of hours of vehicle service and raise enough money for additional transit operating costs. That's mostly going to be along those trunk lines. So when you think of the model benefits of all that hard work on the next slide, what we see is a number of metrics producing quite a bit of benefits on transit access, and that's going to be mostly the increased amount of transit frequency along trunk lines that are part of our regional transit network. And I can share a link to that. That was an action that the SACOG board took last May about increasing frequency, more kinds of services like bus rapid transit. We're seeing those routes across the region by 2050. Access to employment within 30 minutes also goes up a lot, and that has to do with that growth pattern that's part of what Dov talked so much about, where we don't necessarily need all the roadway capacity, but we're building closer to what we have today. The health benefits, I think that's going to be more the compact growth that we're seeing, and the climate resilience, where we're growing as far as lane miles in extreme heat or flood or fire areas. We're not growing all the way out in those areas, but we are seeing some exposure to that. And then lastly, vehicle miles traveled per capita. We are seeing that go down, but the very last row, you see congested miles of travel is going up. We are seeing travel congestion going up because we're not building out the transportation network as much as we did in the past. So lastly, the last slide has a lot to do with hitting that target and keeping access to all of the great state funds that can help us achieve the vision of the plan, where the largest chunk of achieving the greenhouse gas target has to do with that marriage between land use and transportation, where 68% of future growth is in that existing footprint, while we're keep trying to tamp down the number of lane miles to be as strategic as possible. We're trying to double that weekday transit services along those trunk lines, and a decent chunk of that percentage to get to 19% is a mileage-based user fee. So beyond what the state is trying to charge as far as replacing the gas tax with the mileage-based user fee, and then what a regional one would do in congested periods of time. The last piece are more off-model strategies, not specific projects that I was talking with sponsors, but more broader strategies, such as intelligent transportation systems. You could think of that as like traffic signal programming or transit signal priority to speed up buses to get through lights faster and stay on time, to increase that services. To transportation demand management strategies, such as the transportation management agencies. I think I saw Cheryl on the call too, right? What can we do through their organizations, including car share? Then there's what we can do on the local side for electric vehicles and getting folks out of their cars through different infrastructure and incentive programs beyond what the state can achieve. And then lastly, micro-mobility and sharing programs. Those can be your bike share and scooter share programs that we see working well with future mobility hubs to give folks that choice when they're beyond, say, more classic hubs like transit centers like the Sac Valley Station. And I think I'm still under time so far as far as the getting to the next steps on the next slide, where the blueprint itself is much more than land use assumptions that Dov's been working on or specific transportation investments in that list that I've been working on. It's how do we get there? It's this list of policies and programs that the board will adopt as part of that document about things that we need to do to achieve the plan's goals, right? It's how hard we need to work to make as much of this happen as we can, and then revisit it for the next plan update, which will be in 2027, and then after that, another 4 years down the road. Kathy, I think this is some Q&A time, right?
Q&A time, yes. And I believe after this, we'll have Hannah wrap up the presentation, correct?
Yeah, basically Sam did it, but just a couple key pieces I wanted to hit on. In about February, we'll be embarking on our second round of local tours to boards and councils. And so we'll be touring around the region with James, our executive director, and Casey Lazan, our deputy director, to kind of give an update to each council and board on the blueprint. If you're available and tune into those, I highly recommend it. And then one more plug, it seems like we had a lot of interest on the travel model. And yesterday, our colleague, Kyle Shipley, presented to our transportation committee after the transportation committee, so like lunchtime, and I'll send a link in the chat, but it would be an awesome, if you're interested and want to learn more about that travel model, please look at our website. I'll try to drop the link.
Thanks, Hannah, appreciate that. And I think we have one question in the chat. So we definitely do have time for additional questions, and I see Norma's hand is raised, so plenty of time for questions. But Adrian, and actually, I'll go to Norma since you have your hand raised, and then we'll go to Adrian's question about the 19.1% target.
Thank you, Kathy. And I think Hannah started answering my question. I didn't quite hear all of what she said, but I wanted to know, how was tourism travel being built into the transportation modeling? Particularly, because I live in South Lake Tahoe, particularly looking at what's happening along the 50 corridor. And of course, we have the Interstate 80 in terms of, we are seeing here an increase in tourist visitation that is impacting our local transportation infrastructure. And then we need to see that connection that's happening as far as alternatives to travel up to the basin from either I-50 or Highway 50. So I-80 or Highway 50. So I think I heard Hannah saying something about meeting with tourism agencies or something like that, but maybe I misunderstood that. But I'm really interested in seeing that, because that obviously, that kind of travel into the lake, that many cars coming into the lake, is impacting the lake. So we're trying to come up with a balance here between, visitation and infrastructure to accommodate that visitation without, causing additional development that would be harmful to the lake.
I might kick this question to Sam. Thank you.
Sure. So Norma, there's some good news and some bad news, but I'll start with the bad news, which is our travel demand model and how we model trips it's terrific. It's an activity-based model for all kinds of trips, not just commuter travel, but it is calibrated on typical traffic, midweek traffic, middle of the year, not extreme seasons, and not weekend traffic. But the good news is you've got two great agencies that are planning for those kinds of issues anyway, such as the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and the El Dorado County Transportation Commission, where I think one of the most significant projects for improving traffic and travel on at least Highway 50 in El Dorado County is the Trip to Green project, where when you're trying to travel on US 50 to South Lake Tahoe, you're going to get stuck in Placerville, right? They got those traffic signals there. Their project is a way to hold those green, but still help local agencies, local traffic get through a number of different intelligent transportation system investments and other local capacity connections to keep things moving. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag there, Norma, but you do have agencies that are focused on this issue.
So then, Sam, are the work that those agencies are doing, are those also integrated somewhere in the plan so that people have this kind of vision when they're looking at the blueprint that, yeah, we're looking at these transportation issues within these communities and infill and all this that you just described, seeing what else is happening in those other areas that impact the region as a whole by these other separate agencies?
No, that's a good point, and it leads back to SB 375, where part of that legislation has to say that we need to look beyond the region's borders and model how traffic happens between metropolitan planning organizations. For our
Right.
model, those are the different gateways for different volumes flowing into our region, and we coordinate closely with the other MPOs about the travel demand that's pressuring outside of our region and coming in and going into their regions too. So as we do different plan updates, which are not always on the same schedule, we do coordinate closely to make sure our gateways are aligned. We're not assuming more or less travel between regions.
Thank you so very much.
Awesome. Excellent questions, Norma. And Adrian in the chat asks about, I'm scrolling, about the 19.1% reduction target. If we're at 19.1%, 0.1% above our 19% reduction goal, do we get dinged somehow?
No, we do not get dinged. If we exceed the target, that's great. I think the one thing that I would keep in mind is that, so we're showing a 19.1% using our own methodology, right? And then there is a long kind of, frankly, negotiation that takes place between regional governments like SACOG and the State Air Resources Board to essentially get their sign off and approval on how we went about getting to that 19.1. And so having a buffer is a good thing because sometimes that can kind of, be eroded over time through that negotiation as we sort of settle in on kind of an adopted methodology. There's a lot of very technical assumptions that go into getting to that 19.1, as you can imagine. And so it can fluctuate depending on very small kind of changes in decimal points to like, what is the estimated operating costs of a vehicle in 2043? It's like, it gets very complicated very quickly. So it's good to have a buffer.
And Dov, I might just tee up you to finish this, but if we did not reach that 19.1% target, then we would not be able to reach our SES, which would result in us achieving an APS, and that takes away how many billions of dollars of state and federal funding, Dov?
Well, it's a lot. And so a lot of the state transportation competitive funding programs, and Sam can actually answer this probably better than me, are tied to having an SCS, not an APS. And so the 19.0 versus an 18.9 can be the difference between hundreds and hundreds of millions of state transportation dollars.
Thanks.
We have a great article about that. I'll share it in the chat as well.
Thanks, Anna. That's really eye-opening, and appreciate you providing that insight about the numbers. I would love to also, I think since we're in the additional Q&A portion of our agenda today, we definitely want to entertain and answer Richard's questions from earlier. And these are questions primarily directed to you, Hannah, and then Dov and Sam, please jump in as you feel free to do so. But Richard asked earlier at our meeting, I heard Hannah mention that over the last 20 years, the community priorities have remained primarily the same. If I heard this correctly, what would SACOG attribute this to? Can progress on these community-driven priorities be demonstrated over the last 20 years? If so, how we communicate those wins back to the community?
Absolutely. Richard, this is a fantastic question. And there's multiple components to it, but I think in terms of the vision for the future, it can remain the same. That is not to say that we haven't progressed a lot, actually. We've done a really good job as a region and moving forward and kind of meeting some of the goals that we adopted back in 2004, or meeting the principles we adopted back in 2004. I think when it comes to planning, and I'm sure we can all relate to this, it's a long and slow process to see the full plan come to fruition or be implemented to see that change. So I think that's a little piece of it. But I think overall, yes, we have definitely made improvements. I think it's more to that region of choice of like we've made improvements, but we still can make more. And then also in terms of celebrating our wins, I definitely think the cities and counties who are the main people working on these projects absolutely do a great job of celebrating their wins and showing the community what's been done. One way that SACOG is doing this actually for the 2025 blueprint, and you'll end up seeing this in the final plan, is we are working right now with our local agency partners to develop what we're calling jurisdiction highlights, where we're identifying 2 to 3 projects that the jurisdictions are working on that absolutely meet and advance the goals of the 2025 blueprint. Such projects like for Citrus Heights could be the Sunrise Tomorrow specific plan, which takes an existing asset and turns it into mixed use housing. It's just a great project. The community is absolutely excited about it. And so it's just stuff like that. So you'll see some of those more celebrations at the end of the plan.
And Hannah, following up with that question or that answer, how can folks here be involved in that jurisdiction highlights?
So the jurisdiction highlights really are staff to staff work. And so it's more so once you, when they've been published, participate and get involved with your city or county. You can go to city council meetings. You can get involved that way to be a champion for the plan more so.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'll actually go over to Richard's second set of questions as to, and this might be a question for Dov about infill or development in general. Infrastructure to support that growth is always a concern on mine, especially as energy needs increase as a result. In some of the most rural areas, costs for the infrastructure can become potentially a barrier. How is this being studied? And how can the energy needs for this anticipated growth keep emissions goals in alignment? And then the next question is, what steps are being taken to ensure community benefits are at the forefront and not the developers? Currently, displacement is still a concern. How is this being addressed? How do we create opportunity for those communities where infill takes place can grow their generational wealth by becoming landowners?
Yeah, a lot of big ones in there. So I think just on the infrastructure side, so I think this is a really key one. And I think I think what I would first say is there are differences between how infrastructure is financed and paid for depending on what type of growth we're talking about, right? If it's in a rural, if it's in a greenfield area versus an infill area. And so frequently it's actually easier to finance the upfront capital costs of infrastructure in greenfield areas because economies of scale, larger numbers of homes, highly capitalized public builders, right? You can bond against future sale. Like there's all these reasons why actually it can be easier to do that. But it can be, because it's more spread out and you're creating more pavement, harder to maintain that over time. So the maintenance costs can be higher. And then it's like the exact opposite, right, for infill, right, where you have this one-off. And so frequently what we heard in our infill assumptions as well is the projects are not penciling, in part because there's the backbone infrastructure along this 100-year-old commercial corridor is not retrofitted for the mixed-use multifamily project, right? We'd have to update the entire sewer system, right? We'd have and so. But, right, of course, if we build in infill areas over time, the maintenance of that infrastructure is easier because we're maintaining less overall pavement, right? And so there's economies of scale that way. So there's kind of this challenge between those different ways. One of the, we're talking about like how we are implementing the plan. One of the key implementation programs out of the previous 2020 MTP-SCS was a program called Green Means Go, which I think, Steve, you were referencing in some of your comments later. And the premise of that program is essentially, how do we provide upfront capital for infrastructure for infill projects, right? How do we catalyze infill through, these sort of catalytic underground infrastructure investments? And in particular, it's these like non-sexy infrastructure, like underground sewer water stuff that is, frequently doesn't have a lot of, existing funding streams other than just putting it on the developer, which unfortunately just gets passed on to the project and actually makes a lot of these projects infeasible, right? So this entire program, Green Means Go, which has been going on for 4 years now, is kind of oriented around how can we, again, like do some of these kind of upfront government investments in infill areas for infrastructure to try to like put a thumb on the scale for actually developing some infill
Hey,
housing.
I'm sorry. Is somebody like else talking? Like can somebody
a chance? I mean,
hello?
God, we're starting late.
I can hear James talking in the background.
I think it's fixed now.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I didn't hear that, but I don't know if should I start over on that or
I think you're okay to keep going.
Okay, all right.
You're good. Yeah, sorry. I didn't hear any background noise, but I actually just I unmuted you, Jose, so sorry.
Okay. Well, yeah, but yeah, basically, hopefully that answered the question around infrastructure, which is, yes, it is being taken into account in the sense that it's something that needs to be addressed if we're going to actually achieve our infill goals, because the way we finance infrastructure is different depending on where it is in the region. And then there were more questions. Let's see. It was a long question, and there was one about displacement. I see. Okay. Right. And how do we, okay. Yeah, look, I mean, I think, so displacement is happening. Displacement is not a result of development, right? Displacement is a result of prices going up, right? And so I think that, we have to just be aware of and honest with ourselves around the fact that if we do not build more affordable housing types, the places that are susceptible to displacement as land values go up are going to see displacement. So we need to be building a lot more products, right? A lot more housing products in these areas in particular, places where we see a lot of demand shooting up, and that can actually reduce risk of displacement. That said, I think a lot of the like community development community benefit conversation, right? And sort of some of the like rent stabilization and rent control stuff, that all happens at the local level. We certainly have provided a lot of resources to local governments to try to like think through some of those issues, but a lot of that will occur through, housing element processes, right? Local kind of, housing element implementation programs and general plan updates. But that is obviously a key, component that we need to be considering as we're sort of talking about growing.
And I'm just going to jump in and thank you for allowing for those questions. I got to tell you, Dov, that last answer you gave really struck a chord with me, especially in regard to displacement. It is a serious concern for a lot of our residents in a lot of the projects. You may be familiar with Sacramento Investment Without Displacement,
Sure.
The work that they have been doing and the struggles that they've been having for some of these community-based agreements. So it almost sounded like, yeah, we're going to have to deal with this, and I'm in disagreement. I'm in complete disagreement with the wording you used, and I would welcome a longer conversation around that, so that I can go back to the communities that we serve to let them know that all this is being, taken into consideration. Because right now, from a community perspective, it is only the developers who are going to benefit from any of this infill, missing middle housing, et cetera, and so on. Because as you pointed out in the slides, our population can't afford those properties. And so the people who will be able to afford them are going to be developers, landlords, et cetera, and so on. So you're going to be hard pressed to tell people that displacement is being taken care of. But again, would welcome that conversation. My email is in the chat. Would welcome a one-on-one to
Sure.
talk about
Yeah,
that.
I'd be happy to have a conversation, Richard. And yeah, and I think, going back to something that Steve said earlier, right? So our plan is sort of like a regional vision, and it's talking about, basically where housing goes, what type of housing it is, right? And what type of jobs, right? And then individual land use decisions happen at the local level, right? And so the work the great work that you are all doing with investment without displacement is happening through local approvals, right? At the local level. So all community benefits agreements, SACOG would not be involved in that, right? That would be with between, a larger development and the local government. And so I don't mean to pass the buck, and I don't mean to say that it's not important. I just mean to just be honest around the fact that, SACOG would not really have a role there.
And completely understand that you normally would not, but it did almost come across like passing the buck.
Okay.
And we hear that a lot in the community. No, it's county's issue. No, it's city's issue. No, it's state's issue. No, it's SACOG's issue. And so coming together as a region with all of the agencies and all of the entities, and I'm sure you're doing that in the planning, but let's also make sure that community is being taken into consideration for everything in there. And as I pointed out in one of my last comments, you might see that CARB has a community engagement model that they are working on. I have been part of that community engagement model creation for the last 2 years. And so as you continue putting your plans forward, as you continue putting some of these ideas forward and such like that, and we want to make sure we're getting to some of those more marginalized communities and getting their inputs in this. And that's where the CARB model is working on. So you might want to contact CARB and take a look at that model, that it might be helpful in the future.
Okay. Yeah, Hannah, maybe we can take a look at that and reach back out to Richard for a one-on-one.
Will do.
Thanks for the crucial conversation. And I think Hannah did share out about the phase 2 of outreach and how folks can get involved as well. So would love to, I love that, this was a space for this crucial conversation and that we're working together to address concerns. I think, we're at 11:14, but would love to entertain 3 questions. So I'm actually going to go to Ralph's question, and then Steve, and then wrap up with Jose's. Ralph, if several outlying areas are developed at the same time, it would take a long time for full build out and corresponding lower VMT per capita. Less services, that means less services and projects, transit not viable. Is that factored in?
Yes. Yeah, leading question, Ralph. Yeah, and we've talked about this many times. I think, one of the challenges, right, with developing communities and greenfield development, right, is that in the early part of the build out, timing, they tend to have much higher VMT because frankly, the thing that happens first are the single family homes, and then much later is what, you start to get kind of the complete communities aspect that I think we talked about earlier with services and grocery stores and things like that, because they want this kind of proximate customer base first before a business takes a risk on that, right? So the implication of that is that we ideally want to be strategic about how many new developing communities we're starting at one time, right? And ideally, you kind of focus and phase, we're building out these plans first, and then we're expanding that to kind of other plans. And so that's part of the conversation, right, that we go through with our board and with our local governments around, okay, can we prioritize certain areas first and then get to some areas later? That starts to get very challenging, right? There's a political challenge with prioritization because you're starting to get into a the picking winners and losers category, right? Even though we don't necessarily have land use authority or anything like that, that's still up to the local governments. There's still this impression that you're picking winners and losers, and so that is the fundamental challenge, frankly, on the land use side in terms of, in addition to the how do we catalyze the amount of infill growth that we need, and especially in our centers and corridors. The second big challenge is how do we kind of be strategic and phase and try to prioritize certain developing communities first before we move on to other ones.
Thank you. And then Steve had a question about particularly Green Means Go. The Cascade Partners consultant report showed we are behind other comparative regions at producing attached and compact housing. Are there plans to stimulate production through larger Green Means Go or similar programs and partnerships?
Yeah. Well, so I don't want to get too far ahead of or in front of our skis on kind of what the policy and implementation programs will be for this plan, because that's the work that we have in front of us for 2025. But I would say that Green Means Go continues to be, I think, the kind of umbrella program for kind of implementing the infill assumptions of our plan, and I would imagine that it will continue to be moving forward. And so, for example, we just applied for a federal pro-housing grant program, funding program that essentially is all about funding sort of policy change at the local level that facilitates more affordable home ownership opportunities in our infill areas, right? And that's not maybe explicitly kind of the idea behind the original Green Means Go idea, but I think it's again this kind of umbrella program and framing tool that we can use to kind of think through like what can we do to kind of really help achieve the infill assumptions on the housing side and kind of build more attached products in our infill areas. But yes, I think more to come on that, Steve.
Excellent. Thanks, Dov. Last question, Jose. I am concerned about emergency preparedness specifically for exit routes. How are we getting ready for this how are we getting ready for this in our part of school areas?
In rural areas in particular.
Yes.
I can go ahead and take that one. Part of our project nomination process was to share some specific maps with sponsors about areas that are prone to wildfires, as we get from CAL FIRE or 100-year floodplain data, dam inundation maps. What happens if a dam were to break, right? Going through the Oroville kind of disaster idea, or just happened on I-5 just a few years ago, right south in South Sacramento County, right? We know that these things are coming. They are an inevitability, not just once every 100 years kind of worry, right? And asking our sponsors to take a hard look at that, not just the capacity projects that could help address greenfield growth, but the projects that they have on hand. And there weren't a lot of those nominations, but we do know that there's a need there. Part of it also has to do with maintaining the roadway assets that they do have, such as pavement rehabilitation projects. That for a lot of these rural areas, their pavement conditions are already quite poor and they're overdue for investment. So I see in the future being able to address more of that, those joint needs, not only the preparedness, but also the pavement conditions, by helping to these agencies explore more of those conditions, but not only consider capacity increasing improvements, but what amounts to an emergency preparedness plan. As far as what SACOG's work has done in the last few years has been more on the transit and coordination side. That gets back to say like Hurricane Katrina issues. Like, will we be able to have transit operators coordinate and have buses ready to go in coordination with county OES to have viable transportation options for folks that could be stuck in traffic jams trying to escape these disasters. So I think it's quite a complicated issue when you think of the many different ways that we can coordinate and improve ways to escape disasters.
Thank you, Sam, for addressing that question. And I'll see you later, Lori Walker. But I want to give a huge virtual round of applause to our presenters today, Hannah, Sam, and Dov. I'm compiling the information in the chat, and we'll send it to you all as a follow-up for this meeting. But I really wanted to give a huge shout out to you all for the questions and comments. We're just unfortunately out of time, but I do want to wrap up. Before wrapping up, I do want to reserve some time for announcements. Please feel free to raise your hand and go off unmute to share your announcements. You can also share in the chat as well. Do we have any volunteers? I see Adrian in the chat has an announcement.
Thanks, Kathy. And can we give a virtual round of applause for Kathy too for facilitating an excellent, really high quality meeting. Thank you, Kathy. Just two quick announcements. One, Valley Vision in partnership with our friends at Breathe California and Civic Thread and Green Tech have received a community air grant to fund clean air projects in North Sacramento, Oak Park, and Meadowview. We've secured $50,000 pots of funds for each of those neighborhoods to fund community projects. So I'll post it in the chat, but highly encourage you all to explore this opportunity and share it through your networks to get some really, hopefully impactful projects, funded in the neighborhoods that really could use those investments. And then also just wanted to highlight, Valley Vision is the regional lead for a program called We Prosper Together through a state program called California Jobs First. And next Tuesday, December 10th, we're having a webinar about some funding that we've made available through that program for any project that you might be considering related to economic or workforce development that isn't quite shovel ready. So again, I can think of a lot of things that qualify for not quite shovel ready. I hope that you guys will consider exploring that opportunity as well, and I'll post that in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. And I have Richard.
Thank you very much. Just quickly, United Latinos is now actively getting started with the work we're doing with La Familia and their EPA grant that they have received. 18.5 million towards the greening of North Franklin, which will be working, of course, with the Franklin Business District. As we look to some complete streets construction that will be going on along the Franklin corridor. So we're very excited about that over the next 3 years. And then additionally, the work that's going on with the Safe Routes to Schools between Sac City Unified School District, United Latinos, and Civic Thread is going to be kicking off next year as well. So some great things that are going to be coming as a result of that planning too. So thank you all for your time here.
Thanks, Richard. And feel free to send me more information about how folks can get involved in those two huge wins for our region. And then Shira, I see your hands up.
Yeah, so just a reminder on now, Sustainable Santa, come visit us at the atrium. Super fun, family friendly, all plant-based stuff. But second, I did have a question in terms of clean air. Are there any monitoring happening in Old Sacramento? I know we have one monitor that we got through a grant through the city, and that gets submitted straight to the city. As far as I know, we're the only ones monitoring in Old Sacramento. I was just wondering if there is more. But yeah, if anybody has any information, you can DM me.
Yeah, we have some folks from the Sac Metro Air District on the line. They might, maybe if you could put your chat in the, your email in the chat, they can connect with you directly.
Wonderful, thank you. And Deb?
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I have good news. Finally, after 2 years of waiting, the state's incentive program for e-bikes is launching on December 18 at 6 p.m. We have a bunch of material out there for you, for your communities, for people that are in disadvantaged communities to be able to access these vouchers. And we're happy to help in any way, shape, or form. But December 16th, finally, 1,500 vouchers will be made available across the state, and we'd love to see as many of those vouchers in the Sacramento area as possible. Reach out to me if you need some more information.
Thank you, Deb, and feel free to share your email as well in the chat. Yes, echoing that, exciting, very exciting for to end, a great way to end the year, right? So actually, I think if I don't see any further announcements, wow, we're really good on time today. But wanted to close the meeting. I want to again thank our speakers, Hannah, Sam, and Del from SACOG. Thank you so much for joining us today and providing us with an update on the 2025 blueprint process. Again, I want to thank the Cleaner Air Partnership contributors for guiding and supporting our CAP events. Last but not least, I want to extend a huge thank you to you all, our attendees, for tuning in with us today. We'll follow up with an email with relevant resources and links. We'll also post a recording of this meeting on our YouTube channel and our Valley Vision website as well. But I really just want to thank everyone and hope you all have a restful weekend as we head into the holidays. Bye.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.